Test. Oh yeah, looks like I'm good. Okay. I'm Phil Wyman, and this is the Wild Theology Podcast, where the world, the humans in it, and God are all wilder than we've been told.
That's your intro?
So, you'll get philosophy and theology and crazy stories that come from 30 years of pastoring.
Boring.
20 years of festival work.
Whatever.
And the mud and blood of wrestling with the living in the spaces angels fear to tread.
Ooh, trying to sound interesting, are we?
Oh.
Yeah, you think you got something to say?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the problem, dimwit.
Look, I'm a lot smarter than you think.
Yeah, you tightened your shoes this morning.
Whatever. We're Phil Wyman, and this is Wild Theology, where you get to argue with your own ideas.
And lose.
That's the point. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Phil Wyman. This episode of the Wild Theology Podcast is Love Big or Go Home Part 8. And here I'm going to be looking at giving a definition to the word home. So before I start on this, I want to put out a couple quotes. This first one is from Verlin Klinkenborg in a article in the Smithsonian Magazine in 2012 called The Definition of Home. Quote, "When did home become embedded in human consciousness? Is our sense of home instinctive? Are we denning animals or nest builders? Or are we at root nomadic? For much of the earliest history of our species, home may have been nothing more than a small fire and the light it cast on a few familiar faces, surrounded perhaps by the ancient city mounds of termites," unquote. And this next quote comes from Gaston Bachelard and his book, The Poetics of Space. Quote, "If I were asked to name the chief benefit of the house, I should say, the house shelters daydreaming. The house protects the dreamer. The house allows one to dream in peace," unquote. So as I look at the nature of the gospel as being a nomadic or a moving thing, it's also important to understand the definition of home, both as it's seen in culture and perhaps as it ought to be seen in the heart of the Christian believer. So, along the border between Wales and England, there's this loosely defined area called y Mers, in the native Welsh, Marcia Walia in Latin, and in English it's called the Welsh Marches. A march, or a mark, is a medieval word for a borderland. This particular march was a border with a tumultuous history, and it has more castles than any place on earth to prove the point. I spend a good deal of my time in this space between worlds. Lands with a history of war or oppressive overlords have an understanding about home that differs from those who have been brought up in dominating and prosperous cultures. It is true that every group, perhaps every person, experiences and defines home differently. But there's no question that home has a unique meaning to those whose history is defined by losing it, gaining it back, and losing it again to invaders who treat the indigenous people as strangers. One of the great stories of people losing their home and regaining it involves the millennia-long history of the Jews. To go hand in hand with that story, the Palestinians, too, have suffered severe crises at home. Home for both of them is a small tract of land. And it's the same small tract of land. The First Nations people of America have a history of being pulled from their homeland and thrown into reservations, which were the equivalent of internment camps, even when these camps were supposedly granted to them on a sovereign nation basis. Treaties and promises continued to be broken through the generations. Home had a loose definition defined by somebody else, somebody more powerful, who could redefine it, even reset its boundaries at a moment's notice. The dynamics of exile and suffering have created these differing definitions of home. Sometimes home has been somewhere else, a place that is deeply longed for. Sometimes home was less than it should have been because it was marked by violence or unbearable burdens of taxation and labor. In some cases, others treated your home as though it was their own and defined you as the stranger. This was the case in Wales, and the evidence is in the name itself. Wales and Welsh are names given to the area and to the people by the invading outsiders. The name basically means stranger. Yet in the Welsh tongue, they call themselves Cymru, and this means something along the line of comrade or friend. The external circumstances of our homeland establish how we define home. That definition is not necessarily something that can be written into the dictionary. The definition is felt, it's visceral and rises spontaneously with tears and an anthem or a deep gut-wrenching desire wrestled from memories. The Welsh have a word for this feeling, hiraeth, and it's defined by that passionate longing for home. In the case of the Welsh people, it's a longing for that green grass of home back in Wales. Individuals going through crises experience the same sense of longing for home as suffering nations and ethnic groups. Domestic violence may steal one's sense of home and replace it with fear. The death of a loved one may turn a home into a house with no positive emotional connection. There will be people who will never experience anything but longing their entire lives. They will never find the peace of home. Others will take it for granted. For those of us from the dominant culture with middle to upper class benefits or good parents who raised us in relative peace and harmony, home seems all too normal. Yet the fact is that we live in a world with more brokenness than wholeness, and the feeling of home eludes many people. While studying, reading, contemplating in the direction of this podcast, I was at my mom's apartment in the Lutheran Towers in Long Beach, California. I typically spend anywhere from a few days to a few weeks with her. I help with simple daily chores and make sure Charlie, the miniature Doberman, who is the most popular character at Lutheran Towers, is taken for his daily walks. I cook, and Dorothy Jones Jenkins likes soup. She has a particular love for my potato leek soup, which must be the Welsh influence in the genes that gravitates Mom toward leeks. While there, I asked Mom how she would define home. She said, home is the people. And then she dropped back into a reminiscence that she's noted for. My father bought me a home, and immediately my mother disappeared. My family became Muriel and Aunt Dorothy and Helen Krinke and Edith Fuchsman. Now, it was this combination of friends and aunt that became an extended family when my mother was in her late teens and her mom, who had custody of her, became an absentee parent. This is when her father bought her a house in the San Francisco Bay Area to help. And so Mom fell back into her reminiscing. The closest person to me was my grandmother Vasily. She'd look at me from the top of the stairs with tears in her eyes, and you knew that she loved you. Now, this highlights a common thread in American thoughts about home. It's attached to relationships and doing things together. It's discovered around meals and laughter, or someone who is there for you through a rough patch. And Mom went on to contemplate, I've always thought that I'd rather be in a place not so exciting or beautiful, just to be with a group of people. So the psychology behind our houses carry certain and utopian hopes which become embedded in our definitions of home. We may look at the house as a fortress of safety or a place of solace in a cruel world, a place where, according to the theme song of the sitcom Cheers, everybody knows your name. It may be the place of family and ultimate belonging. It's often associated with being able to relax our inhibitions, to simply do what we call be yourself. Home is furnished to accommodate my needs and desires. It protects, feeds, warms, entertains, creates sacred space, allows for gathering of friends and family. Architects and interior decorators embrace these issues to influence house design. Homeless advocates consider the definition of homes and the psychological impact of homelessness. Concerns have been raised that providing shelter is not the same thing as providing a home. There's a difference between rooflessness and homelessness, and though a roof is critical to the welfare of many people, it may not provide a sense of home, and with it wholeness, which may be unrelated to the roof over one's head. Peter Somerville's paper on homelessness in the UK highlights the distinction between a roof and a home in his study, Homelessness and the Meaning of Home. Quote, home can be argued to have at least 6 or 7 dimensions of meaning identified by key signifiers of shelter, hearth, heart, privacy, roots, abode, and possibly paradise. And this brings us back to Gaston Bachelard's words at the beginning of this chapter from his book, The Poetics of Space. Quote, if I were asked to name the chief benefit of the house, I should say the house shelters daydreaming. The house protects the dreamer. The house allows one to dream in peace. Unquote. Bachelard identifies the metaphysical element standing behind the wood and stone edifice we call house and home. It is at its core a place of hopes and dreams. This is where it collides headfirst into the economically formulated hopes such as the American dream, and challenges the Christian to reimagine the home using spiritual reference points. Jesus is our prime example of this reimagination of the home. He sets it in another time and place. It takes on the elements of a utopian dream and moves into the realm of visions for a better world. His promise of a home is more than brick and mortar. It carries the dynamics of family, protection, peace, and the fulfillment of dreams and sets them into a future time. This future home with God is our great hope, and it is the spiritual and supernatural equivalent of Bachelard's daydreaming. Listen to Jesus' words on this. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. We are called to imagine, even to daydream about this place. It is the home we are promised will be ours in Christ. The Apostle Paul puts this daydreaming hope into words that appear to represent his equivalent of the saying, home is where the heart is. And like Christ, Paul sets this into a future and distant place. Quote, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. That's from Colossians 3, verses 1 through 4. So, we are called to give our hearts to this metaphysical home. But this does not mean that we must give up the home we currently reside in. For the many people who have found a home that is both comfortable and fulfilling, they are blessed with what may be viewed as a taster of heaven itself. The home on earth is a good thing. In fact, it is one of the great blessings of life for those who find it. But we are reminded that it is a temporary and, in the true sense of the word, quote, temporal place. It does not necessarily or directly correlate to spiritual things. Yet, this world and all the things in it shall come to an end. But our actions and worship will follow us. We cannot take our money, our most prized possessions, or even other people with us when we die. But we stand naked before God with our deeds. Hopefully, our loved ones will stand before God to meet us there as well. But the travel beyond death is one we travel alone, and we hope to cross the threshold into a new home. One of the questions which arises from the spiritual and future definition of home is this. Are the believers who have found a temporary but beautiful home on earth indebted to somehow make that home a place of hope for those who are not so blessed? We'll look at that in a future episode. But In the next episode, we'll look at what it's like for Christians who are involved in the regional Burning Man events. And we'll be talking with Paul and Joy Burwell about their experiences when I joined them at Unbroken Spring. You want to hear it? Because they're just knocking it out of the park. Thank you to my patrons who help make these missional travels and these podcasts possible. Without you, I couldn't do it. God bless you. If you'd like to support this project, you can do so here on Patreon for as little as $1 a release. And at the most, that's $4 a month.
Why on earth would anybody want to support us?
Well, I think we're pretty cool, and maybe some people believe in what we're doing.
Oh, come on, you believe that?
Yeah.
Don't you ever think you're just a little too weird for the average person?
Yeah, sometimes.